Welcome to the Future of Agriculture podcast, the show that explores the people, companies, and ideas that are shaping the future of agribusiness. Innovation, resourcefulness, and collaboration are essential for feeding a growing population, and we believe the agriculture industry is up for the challenge. Please welcome your host, Tim Hammerich.
Hello and welcome to the Future of Agriculture podcast. My name is Tim Hammerich. I'm an agribusiness recruiter, and it's my pleasure to bring you these stories every week of the people, companies, and ideas shaping the future of agriculture. And we are proud to be a part of the Farm and Rural Ag Network. That is a collection of a variety of different agricultural podcasts and YouTubers. So check out more information on those folks at farmruralag.com. I hope you've been along on this journey with us through the world of blockchain and how that might be affecting the future of agriculture. It's been certainly interesting to learn more about it and to look at it from a variety of viewpoints. We started in episode 81 just getting a general background, and then you heard last week from the founders of Origin Trail that are getting ready to do their initial coin offering for their protocol related to supply chains on the blockchain. Going to get another very important and unique view on blockchain here today, and that is that of a professor of finance. We have on the show Dr. Nishant. He is an associate professor of finance at the Scheller College of Business at Georgia Tech. He's been there for over 10 years and teaches a variety of classes on finance and entrepreneurship and international business. He teaches undergrads, MBA students, as well as executive MBA classes as well. So he is a very, very obviously well-studied, well-read individual, and he's taken a fascination with startups and with the world of startups. He mentioned to me before we started rolling here about how he would just kind of run across startups in his local neighborhood there, and then just became more and more interested in entrepreneurship. So he advises a lot of startups on issues related to finance, but also related to blockchain. And that's kind of why we have brought him onto the program here. He has studied blockchain for a long time and has some great examples here. First of all, how Bitcoin and blockchain are different, built on the same infrastructure, but different. Why blockchain could impact every sector of the economy. He offers some great examples of blockchain potential use in fisheries as well as in wine. And then we talk a great deal about the limitations of blockchain. I have alluded to this in the past, but we get into it more about, yes, we know what blockchain is to an extent, but what is blockchain not? And what are going to be the limitations to its future growth? So I think you'll enjoy every aspect of this conversation here with Dr. Nishant Das. He starts off talking about why he loves working with startups.
But I really enjoy, I think, working with startups much more than, say, a large company, because I think a lot of exciting innovation happens at that ground level, that grassroots level, where the startup is still trying to figure out exactly what problem they're trying to solve, and helping them sort of discover that problem, the right problem and the right solution is very exciting. So I like working with startups very much.
Well, I know you have done some work in a lot of looking into blockchain. Can you, for starters, take us back to when you first found out about blockchain and what your journey's been like in exploring the topic up to this point? I think that will help all of us sort of hop on your journey where we might be today.
Right. So as a professor of finance, I in my sort of, if I put my finance hat, I teach international finance, and I've taught that for 11 years. So much of the course focuses on currency markets and foreign exchange and those kinds of things. And because of that focus on currencies, I came across Bitcoin in 2011, several years ago. And at that time, of course, I thought it was a crazy idea, and the reputation of Bitcoin wasn't pristine. It sort of suffered from its association with actors like Silk Route, and then the meltdown at Mt. Gox, which was an exchange for Bitcoin. All of that left sort of a bad taste regarding Bitcoin amongst all. And so overall, I think Bitcoin very much stayed on the fringes for me. And as we know, it started from those sort of fringe elements who were kind of revolting against the Great Recession and against the large, powerful banks that sort of were, at least to some extent, responsible for the Great Recession. So it started on those fringes, and it stayed in terms of ideas, really on the fringes. Until, I think 2014, 2015, things really started to sort of gain traction, and Bitcoin became of broader interest, came to the mainstream. And that's roughly my trajectory as well. I think around 2014 is when I started to take it a bit more seriously, and thought that there was more to it than just people using it for nefarious activities. So I think, like most people, I started to pay attention to it, and started to pay attention to the technology underlying Bitcoin, which is the blockchain. And I think that, to me, seemed much more promising than the Bitcoin itself. So while Bitcoin is both brilliant and quirky, I think it's just a narrow application of blockchain, and the broader applications of blockchain are much more fascinating, and I really think the possibilities there are infinite.
Yeah, on those possibilities, anyone who's listened to the previous episodes I've done in this series on blockchain knows how excited I am about the possibilities. Of course, we still don't know exactly what those are going to end up looking like. And I've heard people say that, the impact of blockchain could be as big as the impact the internet has had. Do you think that's hyperbole to say that, or is that fair to say?
So I think it's not at all a hyperbole. I think so. Bitcoin price may give you an indication of hyperbole. Look at what happened with the stock price of, for example, a Long Island iced tea company. I don't know if you heard this, but just a few days ago, this company called Long Island Iced Tea, they decided to call themselves the Long Island Blockchain Company, and they are pivoting from making, I think, syrups for iced tea and diving fully into blockchain, and their stock price jumped by 500% in a day. So I think there's clearly a lot of hyperbole if you start to see things like that, or if you see the price of Bitcoin itself. It's gone from, I clearly remember, less than $900 earlier this year to reaching a peak of 19,000. So there is some hyperbole in I think Bitcoin. There's a lot of frothiness there. Mm-hmm. But I think Bitcoin is not blockchain, and I think we need to sort of make that distinction very clear. Blockchain, the underlying technology, is not frothy. It's not hyperbole. I think there's a lot of true promise in that underlying technology. So I think it's important for the audience to make that distinction, that Bitcoin is just one example of blockchain, but blockchain is not Bitcoin. So the frothiness that we see in those prices is not to be confused with the true promise of blockchain. So I think we must remember that the best way to sort of think about what the blockchain can do is, if the World Wide Web was about exchanging information and Bitcoin is about exchanging money, then blockchain is about exchanging value. And if you look at it from that perspective, it's much broader, much more beneficial for businesses, and has a much bigger scope than the internet. I think blockchain, at least in my opinion, will prove to be much more revolutionary than the internet was. And I think that's already a very high bar, because the internet has made a huge impact on our society. It has really improved lives across the globe, and is considered to be one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of civilization. And I think blockchain is going to be much bigger than that. I think blockchain is going to surpass that easily. I at least feel that it's really the genie has been unleashed, and in the coming years we're just going to see much more, transformation of businesses and society. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface here, and I think it's going to impact every industry, every sector of the economy. The businesses that we know today will not look like anything. They would look very different in the years to come. So I think there is perhaps too much excitement in the Bitcoin space, but I think if we start to take a deep breath and look at the underlying technology, there's a lot of promise here.
Can you, diving into that a little bit, some of that promise, some of those applications that you see, most of the people listening here are from, looking at things from an interest in agriculture or food. Could you give us some kind of solid examples of how you see this technology developing in supply chains?
Right. So I think, so first it has to, like with any new technology, it has to address problems. It has to solve real business problems. And only then will it become a must-have technology. Without those real business problems, it'll just remain a shiny, sort of nice to have object. And so that's something to keep in mind. So I think we need to look at where the problems lie. So broadly, I would sort of agree with the 5 things that you pointed out in your recent podcast as the most promising areas. Things like transparency in the supply chain, food safety, transactions costs, accessibility of to new markets, and logistics. I should mention that some of these would sort of reap the biggest benefits by a good marriage of blockchain and IoT, not just blockchain. But still, I think there's a lot of potential for blockchain to bring sort of gains to the agricultural sector. So in terms of actual examples, I can talk about a few. So first, I would sort of piggyback on what you talked about last time, which was your experience working as a grain buyer and all the paperwork that you had to deal with. So I think the problem, as I see, is you at your end had to manage a ton of paperwork and sort of created a ledger, if you will, at your end. The grain farmer also managed a ton of paperwork and had yet another ledger at their end. And then you had another sort of customer downstream that you sold the grain to. They had their own ledger. So I think this is a perfect use case for blockchain because, after all, blockchain is a database that's shared between multiple parties who cannot fully trust each other, and yet would like to sort of modify the database, have some control on that database in a peer-to-peer fashion. So I think, and yet not requiring a central intermediary. So something like that, where you have a lot of ledgers, if you will, and everybody is trying to keep their own copy of the ledger, and then trying to reconcile those to make sure that they're perfectly matched. Those are the sort of typical situations where blockchain can bring in a lot of efficiency. So that's one example that comes to mind. The second I would say is one of the sort of more off the beaten path example, if I would say, is management of fisheries in the food supply chain. So it's not, I don't know if you call that agriculture per se, but in the food supply chain broadly, the management of fisheries is obviously crucial. And I think some of the problems that we see there in the harvesting of fish and bringing fish from water to our table, some of those problems can be addressed with blockchain. So first, what are the kinds of problems? Well, there's a lot of record keeping involved. That record keeping is laborious, it's manual, and it may be error prone. Second, we don't know anything about the conditions in which the fish was harvested, the conditions under which it stayed while it was making its way through the supply chain. Third, we don't know whether the fish was harvested in a sustainable fashion, whether any laws or regulations were violated in terms of where it was fished. And finally, we cannot be sure what we see is what we get. I mean, whether there's fraud or adulteration involved. So all of these problems can be addressed in a very nice way with blockchain, because ultimately it's an immutable and transparent database, if you will. And then I would say another example where sort of agriculture more broadly can benefit from utilizing blockchain and IoT together is the following. So it's sort of an example that's kind of out there. It's not it's not something we would ordinarily think about when we think of agriculture, but it's still within the wheelhouse of what blockchain can do for food supply chain. So the example that I have in mind is from the wine industry. What I was thinking is, so for the most part, the terroir of a region, what they call the terroir in French, that results in the best wines is really a mystery. We don't know exactly what combination of soil, temperature, moisture, sunlight, time of harvest, etc., would create the best wine. And on top of that, you obviously have the grape varietal that plays a big role. So we have a billion possibilities or combinations of these factors that result in a wine that is very distinct. So I think it would be great if we could emulate the best wines and have more of those to go around. And I think blockchain sort of can help us enable that in a way. So what I had in mind is, let's say if individual vineyards could capture all the data through sensors, which is where IoT sort of comes into play, and put that data on the blockchain by acting as a node on the network, then with data analytics, we would know what are the optimal conditions that are conducive to making a great vintage. And the question is, why would a vineyard give away their secret sauce? So I think the answer to that is they would themselves benefit, because by comparing their own vintages across years, they would know what are the best combinations that can result in a very good wine.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And then also it actually, it brings to light what maybe the highest and best use for that grape might be, rather than just putting it in a block with everything else that's in that area. Maybe that grape is very distinct in a certain quality from others that would make, that would add to certain wine flavors. I think that's a really interesting example, because wine is so dynamic that, there's so many variables that you can't possibly, just track everything all together at once. So I think that's an interesting application. Is there anything you hear about blockchain that you just think, seems pretty far-fetched? I mean, the limitations of it, like anything else, we're all going to get excited. There are just unlimited possibilities of what we can do with it. But is there anything that you've heard out there you think, well, that's just probably beyond the scope of what blockchain could really do, at least right now?
So I don't have a particular example in mind, but I think it's important to keep in mind what are the limitations of blockchain. I think it's there are certain limitations, and while it's an exciting, revolutionary technology, it's not the panacea to all our problems. So I think the biggest limitation of blockchain is speed at which transactions can happen, and the fact that it's a very cumbersome and complex technology. So on speed first, so the way the blockchain works is on each node on the blockchain network has to store the entire blockchain and all the states, meaning everything that has happened, the full description of truth has to be copied onto each node. So that provides for a lot of security, but that limits scalability. Now, some of the smartest minds in the space, in the blockchain space, are working on cracking this scalability problem with solutions like things like sharding and Lightning Network and whatnot, which are clearly outside the scope of our discussion. But I think, long story short, the blockchain solves problems in a number of ways, primarily arising from the lack of trust in a central intermediary. But that security in a trustless environment comes at a cost in terms of transaction speed. So I think there is no free lunch. I mean, yes, it solves a lot of problems, but it has its own sort of baggage, if you will. The second limitation that I think of blockchain is that it's not an easy thing. It's a cumbersome technology, and we're not quite ready for prime time. I think folks at the Hyperledger project and the Ethereum Foundation are working very hard to make the technology more accessible to ordinary business folks. But we are still at a point where we need to be a computer science expert to make it work. And it sort of reminds me of the internet of the early 1990s. I think internet at that stage in the early 90s was not something that you and I could have used easily. You had to be able to program things to send an email, for example. I think we're at those very early stages. Some people say it's the technology, the blockchain technology, is still in diapers. I think it's still growing. So there's this cumbersome and complex nature of technology that will make it at least not readily accessible to folks, let's say in the agriculture sector. The third problem with blockchain, in my opinion, is that with any network, I think so it needs a network where everybody within the network is using that piece of technology. So let's say if we think of blockchain within the agricultural supply chain. So how do we convince all the different entities, all the way from farmers and buyers upstream to wholesalers and retailers downstream to be on the blockchain? I think the solution to this lies in identifying a key problem, a pain point that is affecting all these stakeholders. And I'm optimistic about overcoming this hurdle because of what you see happening in the agtech space. Giants like Walmart and Nestle and Conagra are working with IBM and taking the lead and tinkering with blockchain to solve real business problems. So if it starts from them, I think adoption would be much easier. But it's still important to remember that you need the network to accept this as a technology. Mm-hmm. So building the network would be crucial and a daunting challenge. I would like to mention two other sort of somewhat minor limitations, if you will. One is that a blockchain doesn't guarantee truth. What I mean is, if we were to say sky is green and we put that in the blockchain and it's included and accepted in the blockchain, it'll remain there forever. So while sky is not green, but if garbage in, then garbage out. So blockchain is simply an immutable database, but it doesn't guarantee truth. It just says that what went in was untampered and remained so, but it doesn't say what went in for the first time was true. So we have to be very careful about that first entry, the first genesis of the blockchain, that the feeding of the data in the first instance is accurate and true. And lastly, I would say it's a technology used by people, and therefore all the foibles of human nature will affect the governance of blockchain. An example that comes to mind is think of net neutrality. People have been so divided on their views and about net neutrality. The politics of net neutrality has been so divisive. And yet it's going to shape the direction that the future of internet takes. So that is not to say anything about the technology, the internet itself, but how we as a society, as people, deal with that technology is going to affect the future of that technology. So I think the same would hold true for blockchain as well. So it's not a limitation of blockchain per se, but it's something to keep in mind that it's yes, it's a technology, but how we adapt it and how we put it to use will be affected by these sort of sociological and political forces.
Yeah, going back to one of the things you said there, you mentioned like the sky being green, right? So if you and I have a transaction where we meant to say the sky was blue, but we said the sky was green and went in there wrong, we can't change that. We would have to kind of, this is all theoretical, but we'd have to make another transaction that says actually that last one was wrong, and we both agree that the sky is actually blue.
Right.
How it works? I mean, I know it's immutable, but in order to get something changed on the blockchain, I guess you need enough participants to agree on a change. Do you know how that works?
Yes. So if we think of blockchain as a database, so it's a database that is only appended, cannot be edited, cannot be deleted. It can only be, you can only add to it. You cannot take away from it. So if something was added that was wrong, several blocks ago, I should say, and you want to make a change to that block, recognizing a true mistake, then, like with everything else in the blockchain, you have to announce to the network that that particular transaction was wrong, and I'm now going to correct it. So the entire network agrees to that and makes that change or accepts that as a change. So you can't go undo it several blocks ago, but you can write a new block and say that transaction that happened X number of blocks before was wrong, and therefore I need to correct it. Yeah. So like with everything else in the blockchain, you're essentially announcing it to the open wide world, the entire network, that this is what you have and this is what you did. If you did something wrong, you then come again and say, I did what I did was wrong, and therefore I need to make that change. So you can't edit it, you can't delete it, but you can add another sort of block or make additions to the database that say that was wrong, and I need to change it from green to blue.
Gotcha. And then there will be permanently a record that you messed up the first time, but you corrected it and moved on.
That's right.
Understood. So the crystal ball question I have for you here is what do you think the timeline for widespread adoption of blockchain in supply chains looks like? I mean, are we talking, a couple years away, decades away? Well, what does that look like, do you think?
So I think at the very broad level, I would say, just to sort of put some numbers here, I would look at a horizon of 10 to 15 years at the very least to see the full potential of blockchain. I think it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen in a year or two. I would say 2017 for blockchain is sort of like the year 1993 for the internet. I think we are only going to enjoy the full extent of the technology in the years to come. And I think 2018 seems to be a promising year. I think we need to be looking forward to to what will happen. I think clearly we are not there yet. We're just scratching the surface so far. So, in general, I think the Amazons and the Facebooks of the world for any new technology, they rise on the backs of dead companies like Webvans and MySpaces of that world. The pioneers always take arrows in the back, and only then we see the space maturing. And with the price of Bitcoin being what it is, I think clearly there's too much froth in the space, at least currently. And we're in the very, very early stages. We haven't seen the failures of startups. We haven't seen pioneers taking arrows in the back. Once we start to see that, I think then we can expect a shakeout. And I don't think one should not be making precise predictions like this. But let me take a shot at this. So I think 2018 would be an important year because we should expect to see many more blockchain experiments or projects coming online. And I think only in 2019 or so we'll start to see failures. And if I had to really sort of go out on a limb, and I would say late 2019 is when we'll know better what's going to work and what will not. And that would be, at least in my opinion, the right place and time to bet on the future winners. And only after, I think, 2020 and beyond would be the time when we start to see blockchain mature as a technology and go mainstream. And we'll start to see, really solve problems that we are talking about on paper as of now. So I think we're still sort of in the very early stages. We'll see a couple of years will take a couple of years to at least have the technology mature. And only then, in the next 10, 15 years, it'll start to become much more widespread, much more mainstream. I mean, think of the internet. Again, if we're starting in the 1993s or 94, around that period of internet, it took at least 20 years to really see the full potential of what internet could do. And blockchain may be a little more accelerated in that respect. So maybe another 10 years, but no sooner. I think it'll take us a while to really see the full potential of what blockchain can do. It will happen. I think it's almost inevitable. It's like the writing is on the wall. It's going to happen, but it's not going to happen easily. I think because of the few limitations that I pointed out. It's a complex technology. It needs a network. So those kinds of things are going to play a role, and will keep it from expanding and really becoming much more prevalent very quickly. So it'll take a while, but it'll happen.
The question I have, is everybody's got a vested interest in it, but who has enough of a vested interest in it to make a scalable business model out of it? You know what I mean? So
right. So I think, again, I think there are a couple of things that have to happen. One, it has to come from the top, leadership from the likes of Walmart and Conagra and Nestle. And I think we're starting to see that. So I think that's promising. The other is, I think the 5 areas that you identified, those are the true 5 areas. And we just have to figure out what are the pain points that afflict these different stakeholders. If we can bring value, if we can relieve these customers of pain and bring a benefit to them, they will adopt it. It's a matter of finding the right problems to solve, and that's where I feel like we haven't seen startups getting shot in the back with arrows and struggling and experimenting and failing, and then we start to see what are the right areas. So I think 2 ways of doing it. One, the big ones have to take the lead, Walmarts and Nestle's of the world, which they are doing. And second, we have to see a lot of projects come online. Some will fail. Once they start to fail, we'll start to realize what's not working and therefore what we should focus on next and focus on the ones that are going to work. So I completely agree. I think this sort of chicken and egg problem in any network is what prevents a network from taking hold. Right. And blockchain is very much a network. It has to get everybody on board. And how do you get that going? It's not easy, but again, I think the only thing that we as an outsider at least can hope for is that many other projects will come online. Some will fail, and we'll start to see where the best promising areas are.
Great. Well, we've been talking to Dr. Nishant Das, Associate Professor of Finance at Georgia Tech. If they want to reach out to you about any of these ideas or about advising their startup, of course, after your last answer, I bet everybody's going to be waiting around for the pioneers to die before they start their blockchain startup now. But if anybody wants to reach out to you about chatting about these topics, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, so just look me up on the Georgia Tech webpage. Just put my name and Georgia Tech in Google, and you'll find my contact information. And I'd be happy to connect with some of your viewers or listeners, I should say, and see if we can collaborate. I would love to do that.
Great. Thank you so much for the time. This has been exceptional perspective. It's always great to talk to somebody who I know is so much better, well-read and well thought through than I am. And I really appreciate these insights.
Thank you, Tim.
Hope you enjoyed that and hope you have a little bit more information about what blockchain is and what it is not and some potential uses for it. Going to hit a series of startup founders for blockchain applications in the coming episodes. So I hope you'll continue on this series with me. And think for a moment, if you would, one person that you think would be interested in this information shared on the show. And my ask of you today would just be to send that person a text message right now and say, hey, are you listening to the Future of Agriculture podcast? Very interesting series on blockchain. That would be a huge help to spread the word. I appreciate that. And if everybody does it, we'll double our downloads next week. So get right on it. I am sure you will. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with another extremely interesting example of blockchain. This one you're not going to want to miss.
Thank you for listening to the Future of Agriculture podcast with Tim Hammerich. Visit futureofag.com. That's futureofag.com today to get connected into careers in the agriculture industry. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.